Can faith exist without symbols? When a reporter challenges her beliefs, Karoline's response will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about authenticity. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation, as the camera crews adjusted their lenses. Karoline sat across from the reporter, her posture straight and composed, a quiet strength radiating from her presence. Michael, a seasoned journalist known for his sharp questioning, was prepared for what he thought would be a routine interview. He had done his research. Karoline was known for her unwavering faith, a belief system that seemed to shape every aspect of her life. But today, Michael wanted to push the limits of that faith. He wanted to find the cracks if they existed. The overhead lights hummed as the interviewer signaled for the cameras to roll. Michael's voice filled the studio, confident and measured. "So, Karoline," he began smoothly, "you've spoken often about your faith and how it's the foundation of your life. But I've noticed something interesting today. You're not wearing a cross. No visible symbols. Some might say that if you truly lived by your faith, you'd wear it proudly. Otherwise, it seems like faith is just for show." His words were sharp, intended to provoke. But Karoline remained steady. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, and her eyes never wavered. A brief silence filled the room. Michael expected a reaction, perhaps a flicker of insecurity or hesitation, but none came. Karoline had encountered skepticism before. Her faith was not a badge she wore to prove something to others. It was deeply personal, woven into her thoughts, actions, and the way she treated others. To her, faith wasn't about symbols or public displays, it was about who she was at her core. Michael, however, had assumed that because she lacked a visible sign of belief, her faith was somehow weaker or less genuine. He miscalculated. Instead of reacting defensively, Karoline met his gaze with quiet certainty. She could feel the weight of his question, but it did not shake her. This interview wasn't just about her, it was about something bigger. Michael shifted slightly in his chair, sensing he had not rattled her as he expected. He leaned forward, determined to press further. "It's just curious," he continued with a smirk. "You speak about faith so often, but without a symbol, without something people can see, it almost seems like a facade." His words carried an accusation, subtle but pointed. He wanted to expose a flaw, a moment of weakness he could use. But Karoline knew something Michael did not. Her faith wasn't for him or for anyone watching. It was hers alone. The tension in the room thickened. Karoline let the silence stretch, letting Michael sit in his own discomfort. He had expected her to defend herself immediately. Instead, she remained composed, considering her response. Michael's patience thinned as he watched her remain unaffected. He had anticipated defensiveness, maybe even an apology. But Karoline was unmoved. He mistook her calmness for evasion. If she wasn't going to take the bait, he would push harder. "Well, Karoline," said, his tone sharpening, "you talk about faith, but the world has seen plenty of people who preach one thing and do another. So, tell me, how do we know you're not just another example of that?" Karoline's expression remained steady. Slowly, she adjusted her posture, as if preparing for a conversation that required more than just a quick reply. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and deliberate. "I don't wear my faith to prove anything to anyone," she said. "My actions speak louder than any cross, any title, or any symbol I could wear." Her words were simple but powerful. They hung in the air, undeniable in their weight. Michael wasn't satisfied yet. He leaned in, pressing further. "Actions, huh?" he said with a smirk. "What about the times when those actions seem more about you than about faith? When people can't tell the difference between genuine belief and performance? Doesn't that bother you?" Karoline remained still. Though her expression didn't change, a new strength flickered in her eyes. "Faith isn't about what others think of me," she said, her voice calm but firm. It's about the good I do, the way I live, and the integrity I uphold. If you're looking for a performance, you won't find one here. I don't answer to the crowd, and I don't need validation from anyone. Michael narrowed his eyes. So, you're saying it's just about you and your good deeds? That everyone else should just figure it out for themselves? A small, knowing smile crossed Karoline's lips. No, she said softly. I'm saying it's about making a difference, even if no one ever sees it. Faith isn't about being noticed, it's about staying true to what you believe, whether people understand it or not. For the first time, Michael hesitated. He had expected resistance, maybe even frustration. Instead, he found himself facing someone who would not waver, who would not crumble under scrutiny. Karoline wasn't fighting his words, she was simply standing firm in what she knew to be true. Michael exhaled, leaning back slightly in his chair. He had walked into this interview expecting an easy challenge. Instead, he had been met with something far more difficult to shake: unshakable conviction. The world isn't all about personal beliefs, he muttered, still searching for an angle. What if the world judges you? What if they don't see the good you do? Karoline leaned forward, her voice dropping just enough to make every word land with precision. If the world judges me, Michael, that's their choice, she said, each word deliberate. But I won't change who I am to fit their expectations. That's the essence of faith, not changing to fit in, but staying true to what you know is right. Heavy silence filled the studio. Michael had come to challenge, to test, to expose weakness. Instead, he found himself confronted with something deeper: a faith that did not need symbols, performances, or approval. For the first time in the interview, he didn't know what to say next. The smugness he had carried into the conversation had faded. He had expected an argument, but what he had received instead was clarity. Asa continued to roll. The air in the room shifted. This was no longer an interview about Karoline's faith. It was a moment of truth, not just for her, but for Michael as well. Karoline sat back, her presence steady and unwavering. She had nothing to prove, her faith spoke for itself. It was in that moment that Karoline realized something important. This wasn't just about faith. It was about being true to herself, about standing firm in who she was no matter what the world expected of her. Over time, she had learned a powerful truth: sometimes the strongest responses weren't the loudest ones. The most impactful moments weren't always filled with shouting or grand gestures. Instead, true strength came from quiet confidence, from the words left unsaid, and from the presence that couldn't be ignored. The room was completely still, yet filled with an unspoken tension. The reporter, Michael, shifted in his chair, his eyes darting as he searched for his next question. He was waiting for a reaction, hoping to get a response that would make headlines. But for Karoline, this was no longer about a debate. This wasn't a battle of words. This was about being true to herself, no matter how hard others tried to challenge her beliefs. And then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, Michael leaned forward. His voice was steady but carried a sharper edge as he asked one last question, a question he thought might finally break her. So, Karoline, you really think the world should just accept that? He asked, his tone slightly accusing. You think faith is something that doesn't need to be seen or acknowledged? That people don't need to understand why you believe what you do? He paused for effect, narrowing his eyes as he studied her. Isn't it a little hypocritical to talk about faith without showing it in the way people expect? The silence stretched longer than Michael had intended. He shifted again, the confidence he had at the start of the interview now slightly rattled. He had expected Karoline to react with frustration, to get defensive, to feel pressured into justifying herself. But she didn't. Instead, she let the question hang in the air. allowing herself time to think. For her, this wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about arguing or trying to convince anyone. It was about understanding, about clarity, and the years had given her plenty of both. Finally, she looked him in the eye, her expression calm but unwavering. "Michael," she said, her voice steady, "faith is not a performance. It's not something to be put on display for approval. It's not a show, and it's not a costume. Faith lives in the heart. It's in the way we treat people, in the choices we make every single day. It's not about how loudly we proclaim it or what symbols we wear." She let the words settle before continuing. "If someone can't see my faith just because I'm not constantly proving it to them, then that's not my problem. That's between them and their own idea of what faith is supposed to look like." Michael blinked. He had been in countless interviews, had debated people from all walks of life. He was good at what he did. But this moment felt different. For the first time, he found himself hesitating. He wasn't sure how to respond. Karoline wasn't defensive. She wasn't angry. She wasn't here to win an argument. She was simply stating her truth, and it was impossible to ignore. She leaned forward slightly, her voice even gentler than before. "People spend too much time measuring other people's faith," she said. "They judge, they compare, they try to put it into boxes. They act like faith is something that has to be seen to be real. But faith isn't about public approval. It's about what we do when no one is watching. It's about kindness when it's easier to be harsh. It's about forgiveness when it would be simpler to hold a grudge. That's what faith looks like." Michael swallowed, shifting his notes. His usual confidence was slipping, and he knew it. He had come into this interview expecting to challenge Karoline, to make her question herself, but instead he was the one struggling for words. She continued, her voice firm but kind. "I know people judge me," she said. "They look at me and make assumptions about how I speak, about how I dress, about where I choose to be. But you know what? I don't need to convince them of anything. I don't need their approval. My faith isn't for them. It's something I carry within me, and no one can take that away." The word hung in the air, solid and unshakable. Michael sat back, exhaling slowly. He had expected to expose something, to find a contradiction in her beliefs. But instead, he had encountered someone whose faith was so deeply rooted that it didn't need to be defended. For a long moment, no one spoke. The cameras kept rolling, but the tension had shifted. The energy that had once fueled the interview, the expectation of a heated exchange, had faded. Instead, something else filled the space. A quiet realization. Michael, the reporter known for his sharp wit and quick comebacks, found himself speechless. He glanced at his producer, hoping for some kind of direction, but the producer only shrugged. There was nothing left to say. Karoline sat in the stillness, her presence as steady as ever. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't smug. She was simply there, unwavering in the truth she had spoken. Finally, Michael cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Well, Karoline," he said, forcing a small smile, "I think we've covered everything for today." But the words felt hollow. The interview was over, not because he had guided it to a neat conclusion, but because Karoline had already said everything that needed to be said. The crew began packing up, the weight of what had just happened lingering in the air. As Karoline stood to leave, a quiet smile touched her lips, not because she had won anything, but because she had remained true to herself. As she walked out of the studio, the producer approached her. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've seen a lot of interviews," he said slowly. "But this was different. You didn't just hold your ground. You changed the conversation." Karoline nodded, her expression gentle. It was never about changing anything, she said. It was about staying true to who I am, no matter how it's received. The producer said nothing, but the look in his eyes said enough. He had expected a debate, an argument, a moment of tension. Instead, he had witnessed something deeper. As Karoline left the building, she breathed in the fresh air, feeling lighter. The world would always have its opinions, its expectations. But she had learned long ago that faith wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about living it. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered.